Hello everyone, today we talk about the Battle of Azaz, fought on June the 11th, 1125, between the Crusader States army commanded by King Baldwin II of Jerusalem and the Seljuk Turk army of Aq-Sunqur, il-Bursuqi. And I think that this video will be fairly short because there is not a huge amount of information about this battle, but it's still, for didactic sake, in a way very important to look at the engagement because it portrays pretty well the divide that eventually there is between the sources and the historical judgment. Before we get started, we give some background here. So Joslan of Edessa had captured Azaz in northern Syria from the Atabeg of Aleppo 7 years before, and in 1119 the Crusaders under Roger of Salerno were severely defeated at the Battle of the Ager Sanguinis that we will have to see in another video. And King Baldwin II of Jerusalem was captured himself by patrolling in Edessa in 1123. The year after the king was released, and almost immediately he laid siege to Aleppo. This caught the attention of il-Bursuqi, the Seljuk Atabeg of Mosul. Il-Bursuqi marched south to relieve the siege of Aleppo, which was nearing the point of surrender in January 1125, after a 3-month siege. And in spite of the city being the greatest prize the war could offer, Baldwin cautiously withdrew without a fight. So, getting to the battle, here we will sketch it, and then we will pass to the two most important sources. There are Fulcher of Chartres and Matthew of Edessa. And first of all, reading the text, or at least summarizing them, because they're relatively short, and then pass to see some study at least that I've given a look to, and interpretation is given to the battle. And we'll try also to make a comparative analysis with other battles, Crusader battles we have already seen, right? Because there are interesting points in common, especially with something we have seen, for example, at the Battle of Aten, from the account of Matthew of Edessa. This passes a bit in second, on background, because Fulcher of Chartres gives perhaps, I presume this is the reason, gives a bit more of, the account is surely more detailed. There is a greater, let's say, context that is given before, but if the battle is actually very, it is less informed than the account of Matthew of Edessa. It gives a bit more of numbers before at some point, but even the Syrian source is spot on, and we'll see what's the deal there. So basically at this point, il-Bursuqi, who had received troops also by Toghtekin of Damascus, it was this other Turkic military leader, Atabeg of Damascus during this time, besieged the town of Azaz in the north of Aleppo. Right, it's this small city, and today it's been ravaged by the war in Syria recently. I mean, it's depressing, but it's more all of this northern theater of the Crusader state, only the clash between. This was specifically in the territory belonging to the county of Edessa, right, but at the eastern border with the Seljuk lands. So this was the war zone. So Baldwin II, Leo I of Armenia, as it was the 5th lord of the Armenian Cilicia at this point, Joslan I, and Pons of Tripoli, was Count of Tripoli, with a force of 1,100 knights. This is the number that gives Fulcher of Chartres, from their respective territories altogether. So we're talking essentially, mostly actually the Antiochian troops, because Baldwin of Jerusalem was regent for the Principality of Antioch at this point, as well as 2,000 infantry, and met il-Bursuqi outside Azaz, where the Seljuk Atabeg had gathered his much larger force. We'll see more or less the maximum is given to 15,000 troops that the Turks might have gathered, but we'll discuss that later. But all the sources stress, somewhat stereotypically at the time, but probably not very far from the truth. Probably the number of the Turks were inflated, but that's usually the proportion we find also from the Muslim sources at the time. And Baldwin, at this point, we'll see it. So I'm reading, actually, this is just a synthesis, like the sketch from Wikipedia, because I want to show you exactly how this battle can be interpreted. Like, you read Wikipedia and read the stuff and you say, wow, so it went like that. Well, actually, we don't know. But Wikipedia in here, it's fairly precise because it is actually quoting the the thing, I don't know, from, I presume from other studies, because here they didn't, here I see here that they don't quote the sources, but having read the source, this is what Matthew of Edessa actually states, right? So he, as we will see, he said that Baldwin made this feint flight fundamentally, or fake retreat. We'll see it better. So drawing the Seljuks away from Azaz into the open, where they were surrounded. This is here, I don't know where he gets this from. And after a long bloody battle, the Seljuks were defeated and their camp captured by Baldwin, who took enough loot to ransom the prisoners taken by the Seljuks, including the future Juslan II of Edessa. Relatively to the casualties, here says the Muslim troops killed were more than 1,000, according to Ibn al-Athir. This is an important Arab or Kurdish historian and biographer who wrote in Arabic, from the second half of the 12th to the first half of the 13th century. William of Tyre gives this number of 24 dead for the Crusaders and 2,000 for the Muslims. Fulcher of Chartres suggests 5 emirs and 2,000 soldiers dead, while Matthew of Edessa estimated 15 emirs and 5,000 troops killed. Right. So this is actually correct, and in fact, it's strange because here on Wikipedia, someone inserted on the note citation needed, and this is actually the most precise of all the information that is being given, right? But they forgot, or maybe they thought it wasn't necessary to insert the note. So, relatively to the aftermath, il-Bursuqi retired to Aleppo, leaving his son Masud as a government, crossed the Euphrates to Mosul, where he gathered troops to renew the fight. Apart from relieving Azaz, this victory allowed the Crusaders to regain much of the influence they had lost after their defeat at Aq-Sunqur in 1119. Baldwin planned to attack Aleppo as well, but Antioch, which passed to Bohemond II when he came of age in 1126, began to fight with Edessa. Right, and the plan fell through. So typical, right? I wonder what these people were doing there, right? Both the Christians and the Muslims. It wasn't much only about fighting each other. It was actually fighting within themselves, right? And Aleppo and Mosul were united eventually under the much stronger rule of Zengi in 1128, and Crusader control of northern Syria began to dwindle. But this does not pertain to today's video. So today, as you understand, these videos are essentially tactical analysis. So the strategical picture is clear. As usual, medieval battles gravitate around the siege of a city. The Turks were besieging the fortress of Zardana. The Crusaders arrived to relieve the siege, and the Turks basically rise the siege and retire northwards towards Azaz, right, where Baldwin's force caught up with them. Now, starting from the account of Fulcher of Chartres, here we basically get the direct impression that simply the Crusaders went for it, right? That they meet the Muslims, they attack them, and they win, quite simply. Fulcher gives interesting information, however, about the both actually the Christian and the Muslim array, in part because he talks for the Crusaders. first of all, as we've seen before, of 1100 knights and 2000 infantry, which already speaks for the broader even cavalry infantry ration here. So you understand here the cavalry is dominating, because the infantry, yes, it's important, but let's say in terms of 2-to-1, right, it's not that they could do much against cavalry themselves. We'll see from the account of Matthew of Edessa that probably the picture also was more shaded. Not all the knights, of course, were heavily armored, and the impression, generally speaking, is, you know, it's a kind of a realistic number. First of all, given the, you know, the potential of Christian powers at that time, etc. The numbers given for the Muslims are high, very high, and there is the idea, generally speaking, there are sources who talk, I don't know, even of larger numbers, but all balanced together, we think that the Turkic forces did not exceed 15,000. Matthew of Edessa speaks of 40,000 men, which is excessive. These were, by the way, two different contingents that had blended together, the one from Mosul, the one from Damascus. They were coming in force. This is true, and it's absolutely probable, right, that the Turks were really way more than Crusaders. I think there is no doubt about this. It's just that, you know, realistically speaking, we speak mostly of 15,000 men. And here I do agree with the broader historiographical, you know, assessment, because I think that this is not this doesn't come from any source specifically of the ones I've read, so it's just an estimate. So it's perfectly fine. And these sources also all stress during, just we'll see even now that from the lexicon and from, you know, explicitly sometimes also always giving the idea that the Muslim forces were larger. So it says that Fulcher says that of these 1100 cavalry and 2000 infantry were split in 13 cunei. Now, we know in Latin what the cuneus is the wedge, right? It's the wedge formation that took broadly the name from the idea of the geometrical form, but here it's mostly meant organically as a unit. So making the mass, basically each cuneus on average would have not been larger than 90 men, which is usually, in fact, what normally these repartitions were about. I mean, there were subunits. We can imagine, like, mostly 2 subunits for cuneus. There's 40 knights that acted together, and it's mostly, in fact, binary split of the various subunits. 13. Fulcher says them that the king was ordinatissime preparatus, which means we were mostly well organized and prepared for the battle. So it gives the impression, naturally, that there was also he wasn't there just by chance or undecided on what to do. Everything had been planned. This may be just a literary embellishment, right? We don't really know. We'll see, especially from the account of Matthew of Edessa, that things might sounded, way more dramatic, at least from his perspective. And he says that these 13 cunei were distributed into horns, right? The cornus, literally. And he said that on the right, so normally we have seen also in other Crusader battles, as most of also medieval armies were organized, like there were 3 divisions, let's say. They're here are called horns, right? Habitually by the sources. A right, a central, and a left one. So on the right one, the Antiochians were deployed. In the left one, the Tripolitanians and the Edessans. So here there was also Joscelin. And the third one was the the largest one, because it says densiore et posteriore, which means that was not only the largest, literally the thickest in Latin, but that's what it means, but also that it was in the posterior position. So some historians didn't like this explanation, said there's something missing here. I'm using here a version of a study of Fulcher's that is in German. Think about it, and it's very old. Presumably, I have not looked the date, but here quotes some authors and that were skeptical about it. And actually, he who wrote this critical edition says, after all, the meaning is quite simple, and objectively in Latin it is, because it simply says that there were these two wings, right? There's two horns, the left and the right one, that we know they are advanced simply because the larger, the central one, was instead behind them. So we've seen also in other Crusader battles, like, I don't remember what was the last one, there was a problem of this kind, that actually these divisions didn't proceed all close together. Actually, if you study medieval warfare, you realize that battlefields were very extended for many reasons. In this case, possibly also because the broader, in Europe, it would have been mostly about meeting in a large plain, especially in these corridors along rivers, where there could be probably just like a tournament, this battle, but they were kilometers long, right? So literally, when these divisions met one against the other with this gradual effort, based on the economy of forces, using these divisions as reserves and lengthening the engagement, sometimes certain divisions didn't even realize what was going on, right? Because they were kilometers away. So these guys were fighting. They would acknowledge that one division had been broken, or just later when it eventually happened. In the Near East, in the Holy Land, during this wars against mostly the Seljuks, but also against the Ayyubids, or the Egyptians, probably meant, the thing is that the Muslims, as we've seen many times, strategically tended to give way, right? Basically luring the Crusaders in unfavorable positions, harassing them with their horse archery. These were Turks, so specifically their composition was way more, characterized by horse archery than, say, the Egyptians, that were, say, more similar to Christians in a way, as more sedentarized people. The Turks here had, we've said it many times, this narrow yet pretty damn good armored elite, and then all the rest was basically made up of this huge swarms of horse archers, were basically unarmored, and they simply harassed. I mean, they didn't have individually the force of wearing out the enemy army completely to wipe it out alone. So the whole thing was for the elite to wait the right moment to charge. Crusaders were exhausted, but the problem was that the Crusaders were also pretty damn well armored, way more than the Muslims were on average, especially against probably against the Turks, and the whole balance was dead, and that reflected itself naturally from a strategical point of view, because we see these retreats that lasted days and days to exactly wear out the enemy, the Crusader armies. But also from a tactical point of view, because the point was also exploiting, for example, the maneuverability of the lighter cavalry, making these feint flights were typical of the Turks specifically, and generally speaking, playing on the mobility, on number, right? So trying to also surprise the Crusaders on the flank and all this stuff. So it wasn't easy at all to get there, as Fulcher says, and find the Turks ready to be charged, right? It was risky. We even know that there were literally charges that were that timed out in a way. They weren't fast enough to reach the Turks in time. So this was a big problem, also because charges were, it's not that you can repeat them infinitely. The Western Knights were capable of performing that in extremely difficult conditions, and were pretty damn good at it. But at the same time, a wasted charge doesn't go without consequences, right? Here, think the battle being fought in June in Syria, so it's already pretty hot, and the general resistance, also considering the conditions we've said before. Think about the fires, the smokes were lightened up to literally to smoke the Crusaders, and the harassing of the arrow fire and all this stuff. That is something that wears you out, and carrying out a charge is something you do not to show these guys away while you're doing this, but simply when you find enough enemy mass to charge through, right? So Fulcher here is quite, can't say positivistic, but he simply says, okay, the Christians arrived, met these guys, charged them, and they were defeated, right? But this arrangement of the 13 kunae scattered in these 3 horns, and the fact that the first 2 ones were advanced compared to the last one, sounds pretty. The larger one of also where the king was, sounds pretty much like that these guys didn't know where the Turks were. At least they sent a vanguard in the form of these 3, in these 2 wings, basically, these 2 divisions that were also presumably far away from each other. So they took different ways. And as we've seen in previous battles, there was also a lot of, properly competition between these various powers. Here we specifically see that the division of the army is based on the origin, right? The right wing is Antiochian, the left one is Tripolitanian and Edessan, right? So these were literally different people that had different commanders that were in a way there on their own, and it was very difficult at the time to have something like a centralized command, right? It was based sometimes in the initiative of these on these single commanders, and this could as well unfold, tactically in an attack, maybe of one of these divisions without order from the central one. I mean, doing literally coping with their own sector on their own, right? And the others just eventually acknowledging that and acting upon it. We've seen it many times. Then Fulcher says that the Turks were divided in 21 phalanxes. Now, the Latin term phalanges in medieval Latin simply has nothing to do with the composition of the troops, if not for their size. Here, it's specifically used in in contrast with the kunae, because the kunae is by itself, as we've seen also in other also in classical Latin, refer to smaller units, right? Instead, if you say the phalanx, you really intend the whole array, a whole massive line, or at least company size thing, just orientatively. So when you read this in Latin, has in medieval Latin, phalanx has nothing to do with how these troops were equipped. These were both in Crusader kunae and in the Turkish phalanges. You have both cavalry and infantry. The difference, which probably did exist. I mean, I don't think Fulcher is here necessarily making up the thing, but it's the still, in literally speaking, it renders as if the phalanx is larger than the kunae. So together with the statement multitudo of the Turks, I mean nemperet copiosa, together with the phrase means it really wants to make you show that the Turks were more. They had larger units. They were altogether more than the Crusaders. So in here we can imagine of these 21 phalanxes that are were objectively larger, if anything, just also mathematically speaking, if we estimate 15,000 men altogether, here we have an imposing like more than 700 men per phalanx, let's say. So it's definitely larger. It's like 9 times larger than a kunae, right? So here maybe it's the exaggeration, but we don't exactly know how this, nor first of all how many the Turks really were, and also about the internal composition, because once again, as we were saying before, you can have maybe these larger units, but they may be composed of much lighter troops, as it was on average compared than to the Crusader ones that were better armored and so on. So it sounds slightly fictional, exaggerated, but the sense is that one, and it's essentially correct in conceptually speaking. So the rest of the account is really pretty simple, pretty standard topic in a way, right? The Crusaders call for the help of God. Eventually, they charge, and they here it says that the Turks actually resisted for a long time, or powerfully, let's say that, but that eventually they fled and they dispersed. I mean, and that's literally it, right? So this is just for making you understand that at a time, how simple. Like here, the episode of the World War lasts like 10 pages, right? And the whole thing of the battle is liquidated like in 3 lines, right? And this makes you understand what all these medieval authors, most of the time, at least at this point, cared to tell, right? Who did care exactly about these tactics? I mean, the clergy wrote this stuff for essentially making it an edifying story, more or less degree of realism, naturally, because these are good accounts after all. I mean, the Christians had the best historiography. I mean, if you read the Muslim historiography, it's way more vague, right? After all, in the West, if anything, we had since Thucydides, Xenophon, etc., something that is meant to explain in a kind of logical, rational way what happened. Here, it offers objectively a lot of information, but altogether about the strictly military side of the story, from this thing we know very few, because if you read it, you get this interesting information of how the armies were organized, more or less, but it's pretty vague in itself. But it's just to give mostly an impression, and it doesn't tell you how the battle was fought, right? So let's pass to Matthew of Edessa, right? That we can't read also since the beginning. This is also already translated, so it's easier in a way. So it says here, Matthew of Edessa is this important Syrian, Christian Syrian source that sometimes is even, he doesn't like the Franks very much, right? So let's start from this point of view. It's not that much people liked each other, and for this reason it renders also a more pathetic view of how the engagement went. But it's important to remember here that Matthew actually knew people that had fought in the battle together with the Crusaders, by the way. So this is particularly important because some authors said, oh, well, this whole story is strange, because as we'll see now that there is something that it's not wholly explained in it. So many said, oh, it's fictional. Well, why should it be fictional? Actually, it says important that you can't expect from a 12th century source to be perfectly coherent and precise, right? They didn't write like that, and we can actually learn and get a lot of information exactly from, in fact, getting in tune, let's say, with the way they express themselves, because at the end of the day, it's exactly because they say a few that the single things that they say should be understood, right? Doesn't matter if they're necessarily logically or rationally changed. The important thing is that they have said it, and that was something relevant to point out, and you have to try to interpret why. So here it says, in 574 of the Armenian era, so it's 1125 AD, Bursuqi Spasalar of the Persians came with many troops, including Tugtagin and 40,000 men with them, as we've seen before. These men were the most select of all the troops of the Persians, right? Bursuqi came with this. So what does this mean? Not much, right? Meaning that this was properly an army of invasion, right? It doesn't mean that there were an all-elite unit. Because objectively, we don't know how many troops they had, but they had also the infantry necessary for the siege. We know that there were siege engines used to besiege both the fortresses in here. So that's an important aspect, and it's meant in this sense. So Bursuqi came with this great force and descended opposite to secure the secured fortress of the Franks called Azaz. He waged intense warfare against it and boasted about taking it with all his might. He ridiculed the strength of the Franks. He erected 12 catapults opposite it. Digging, they collapsed 2 of its walls. Azaz was in grave danger, and its defenders within had given up hope. Right. So first of all, we didn't talk much of the strategic background here, but here the siege had gone on for 3 months. Here I spare you all the chronological calculations and so on, all the various sources. But you don't lose a fortress like that. That's what naturally triggers the battle. But it also shows that's where literally the whole strategical object gravitated around, right? So when you think why an army would engage here, well, here we can find the measure of it. So even the confidence of the Crusaders here was always, like the confidence of anyone was always a problem, right? Here we read these sources always from the Western, mostly from this better informed Western side, as if the Muslims were always like, all might, very powerful, terrible, hordes that arrive, destroy, and both are arrogant and so on. So they surely were, as much as the Crusaders were, but these were still medieval armies. I mean, they were intrinsically difficult to put in motion. There was always a great risk in all these enterprises, as in anything in war. So it's always about, you don't know what's going to happen, right? You cannot study military history pretending that there is a positive expectation to make it all the time, so that, I'm stronger, now I go there and I destroy these guys. No, right? It has literally, nobody has ever reasoned like that. It was always, let's try to do it, and we're risking like crazy, and every victory was at a point one step away from total disaster, right? So the ability here is to stays in all those qualities that we have naturally looked in the Fulcher, and they're mostly things that are decided over time, and as we were explained before, also the way battles were fought with this use of different detachment, different divisions, trying to cope with the situation, also not to risk everything in one shot, was all designed for the Muslim side. Also this retreat, this attention not to expose too much the troops to the Crusaders, etc., was all designed exactly for remaining very cautious, but also trying to exploit any profitable situation in the process, every mistake of the enemy. Then Matthew goes on and says, now the king of Jerusalem learned that Bursuqi had to return to Aleppo. He arose immediately and went to Antioch. He notified the troops of the Franks, and Count Joscelin went to the king with great enthusiasm. Also arriving here, the Count of Tripoli, the son of Saint-Gilles, and the Count of Duluc-Maurice. The assemblage of troops of the Franks contained 1,300 cavalry and 500 cavalry proper from the Armenians, as well as 4,000 infantry, right? So this is interesting because compared to Fulcher, we're seeing the numbers before. Here it's actually more cavalry than they were saying before. I mean, the Crusader army is larger, broadly speaking. It's almost double sized both in cavalry and infantry. Specifically double-sized in infantry is 4,000, and 1,300 cavalry meant properly of Crusader knights here, and we don't know how many Turcopoles, they weren't all heavily armored troops, but there are also 500 Armenian cavalry that was on average lighter than the Crusader one, but it has nothing to do with they were just light cavalry. No, they had their heavy cavalry as well. So we have fundamentally 1,800 cavalry. That is an important number more. It's 700 more fundamentally than Fulcher said, to the 1100, right? And the enemy, however, is still 40,000. So even in Matthew's proportion, the Muslims were way more than the Crusaders. So then he writes, the king of Jerusalem came and descended on Cyrus, who was displaced north of Azaz. When the Spazalar of the Persians heard about this, he went with his troops and encamped close to Aleppo. Then the troops of the Franks left all their baggage at Cyrus and went to Azaz in full preparedness. So this is interesting because it shows something that we have observed also in other Crusader battles, that there was like probably an expedition where even the baggage was left in a center, and the Crusader troops went with the necessary out there, considering the Muslims here were giving way as usual to go after them. And this meant naturally that the whole Crusader army could be more agile, faster, right, and therefore more apt to cope with the Muslims, because we have also the idea that as we were saying before, the Crusaders were heavier, so they were always heavy, and the Muslims were lighter, so they were always light. Well, it wasn't really like that, right? They were actually much more similar than we often think. So the tactical essentials weren't changed here, and that also corresponds to the heaviness or lightness of the troops, but still consider that we're talking about very dynamic strategical actions, given you even left the baggage in another place. And here also Matthew says that, just like Fulcher, that the Crusaders were fully prepared for this. So yeah, they were getting to it, but the risk was always there, right? They were evidently confident, but this is also usually what the Crusaders always are, strategically speaking, for reasons that have to do with literally the military instruments at their disposal. Like, if you don't run after those guys, you don't go for it, they won't let you get them, and the fortress will fall, and you will have spent all these resources that had a great political and social cost in vain, right? So it's not just propagandistically saying, look, the Crusaders, they really knew how to do. No, well, the thing, as far as we can understand here, was pretty balanced morally from one side and the other. It's just that they normally fought that way because that was usually the balance of forces given the specific composition of their armies and their political and social background. That's it, right? There were differences, and this is what it brings on the field. And it was always a risk, because you're playing at the enemy's game by pursuing him, right? Because they decide where they're going to be pursued, and that can be also always risky. In fact, let's see what happens, because here, as we were saying anticipating before, the account of the battle is way more dramatic for the Franks than the one of Fulcher. Matthew says, they saw that Azaz had been wrecked and almost demolished to its foundation, right? So the destructive potential of the Turkic Polish was here, doing its job. And Bursuqi and his forces were close to taking it. Then the troops of the Persians turned upon the troops of the Franks and surrounded them for 3 days. Now, this is a big thing, right? Because you realize it's nothing like you would imagine from Fulcher's account. It says, the Christians went there, they attacked the Turks, and these guys resisted a lot, but they were defeated. Here it says plainly that the Turks fled for a while and then basically came back on the Franks and surrounded them, and this situation went on for 3 days, and the baggage was left, at least the main one, because of course they had it, but in a lighter fashion back in Cyrus, right? So this is not a quite positive situation, and it does resemble a lot, actually, other situations we have seen, also because especially the Battle of Hattin, where the Crusaders had been surrounded. Here we can't talk, unfortunately, there is not much further information in terms of the position of the various forces, like we have for Hattin, for example. But for saying, the Crusaders are surrounded, right? Hattin was also a march in probably, we don't know actually whether worse or better conditions than this one, but at least the Crusaders had an objective pushing through to reach, if you remember, the fortress that was threatened by Saladin. Here they were going against properly the army. So the fact that you go against an army that you want to destroy, and then you end up encircled by it and remaining like that for 3 days, doesn't absolutely speak for a positive situation, and especially not for an advantageous one from your side. So naturally, this picture was conversely difficult also for the Turks, that as usual had this problem of naturally these armies on their own, and we can't calculate that, had a certain time they couldn't exceed, or staying literally on the field, because supplies and it's a complicated business. But specifically, they probably couldn't break through the Crusaders. They were just trying to wear them out as usual, and the Crusaders conversely trying the right moment for the Turks to unmask and to charge through them. But naturally they were going back and forth in the usual hit and run tactics, confusing the enemy. We can't simply imagine it, given all the battles that we have seen so far. The fact that this is not present in the account doesn't mean that it did not exist. This is trying to apply military logic that we see applied basically wherever there is that level of information in all these other engagements. And this is what properly should be done when trying to think a bit more strategically, let's say. Matthew writes, the troops of the Turks surrounding them, the Crusaders, were shouting and boasting, right, with shrill cries like an eagle swooping down on a flock of doves. The troops of foreigners, one and all, applied themselves to the troops of the Franks. This speaks for the millenary military musical tradition that existed in the Middle East, that we already also made a video on, and that was based literally on this intimidation. Western armies pass for here as less musical, less noisy in a way, because their point was mostly taking all this enemy provocation and then finding the right moment at the end of it to still remain standing and launching a charge that could wipe also the exhausted enemy. This guy, the Turks instead, they couldn't break through, as we've seen immediately, so they literally used everything, including these war cries and other quite disturbing effects to psychologically more than physically break the enemy. So this also is normal, actually. And the Crusaders at this point, that were there since 30 years, were probably well aware of such practice. This is to be found also in other cultures, in other military histories. Generally speaking, there is this divide between the West and the East at certain levels, also in colonial history. A bit for the same reasons, because usually the Westerners had, the best equipped, more drilled, more, let's say, collectively static also forces that could wait there and deliver all these forces at the end. And these others also instead turning around them, harassing them, and having this molesting effect. Now this is the interesting part coming, because Matthew writes, on all sides the troops of the Christians were without recourse and terrified and longed for death, and had reached their last breath. So here we can actually say that this was probably like the Crusaders were exhausted. 3 days, right? This is not even, Hattin was just 1 day after. There were actually 2 days, but the Crusaders were surrounded for 3, only for 1 fundamentally. So just think about what it means, right? And they're apparently idling. So evidently their command is saying, what the hell do we do? And they were waiting and waiting. 3 days is a lot for these times. I have difficulties to find here specifically in a non-fortified position, aside from the camp that they surely built, but such idleness in front of this threat. This really speaks probably also for the high numbers of the Turks, right? Because had they been less, probably the Crusaders would have simply had to advance, not doing much in this regard. The enemy forces would have melted away. This seems both for the surrounding, so literally you have the Turks have enough forces that can surround and put the Crusaders in difficult, so not thinning their lines around them. At the point the Crusaders have difficulties to break even in this stretched perimeter. So that's very, very interesting. So Matthew writes, while matters were in this fraught condition, the king came up with an excellent plan. So they were making their mind work, solution of course. And he told the princes of his troops, come, let us turn toward Al-Atarib, which is this place called Tereb today, and have the troops of the Turks believe that we have fled. That way, those in the ambuscades will come forth and chase after us. At that point we will turn on them in battle, and we shall see what Christ will do for us. So here, this is probably the most fascinating passage, because it reveals a lot of interesting stuff that, however, is not fully coherent with its parts. So the king Baldwin comes up with this idea of moving towards Al-Atarib. So basically, to come back in part and have the troops of the Turks believe that we have fled. So the fact that the Crusaders could move here, even assuming that they could have done it covertly, like at night or in situations that were difficult, but presumably, because naturally these troops we've seen it also at Athens usually were very closely encamped. They could hear their voices in the distance, and like, you don't move an army of thousands of men without notice, right? Naturally, until especially if, I presume it was done at night, it's more realistic in a way. Until the day breaks, you try not to risk, right? With a counter move, even if you know that the enemy is moving and is slipping away. But this is exactly the point. Weren't the Franks surrounded? What kind of surrounding was this that they had? They could retreat and make the Turks think that they had fled, literally, or retreated. Sure, they could have fought through the Turkish lines had they been completely encircled, even during the night, and broken through them and gotten away. But this sounds more like, if you do that, you're still in a condition for which, presuming you're literally surrounded, that's a difficult thing to do, right? And probably the Turks will not sit there. Even just the forces will try to exercise some pressure, even had it been at night. So this sounds as if maybe they were encircled like on three sides, and the only space they had gap they had left open was one of the retreat. It's possible. But this reveals also an awareness, by the way, of the Crusaders towards the ambuscades that they realized were out there, because the Turks, as we've seen, normally did conceal forces. And this may be a hint relative to the Crusader lack of confidence, maybe of pushing through, because they knew that out there were concealed forces that they could ambush them, outflank them, and carrying out nasty surprises on them. So they are there after 3 days. So whatever the situation was here, it's really not clear, right? Because if you can't break through, is it possible to stay for 3 days to be harassed by the Turks without doing much, and then you decide to retreat? Or, if you're completely encircled, you try to break through, but the next day you're able to redeploy for battle, and eventually with a successful one. We've seen even at the Battle of Hattin, for example, how these battles were very hotly contested. Like, you can't say these engagements were decided since the beginning, right? Both armies were one step away to melt away throughout all that. So the idea that this from both sides was just an absolute mastery for which an enemy was caught in trap and that was it, we've seen it clearly for Hattin, because Hattin passes just for the Great Crusader defeat. So the Saladin must have just done the perfect thing, and he just swallowed them, and that was it. If you study the battle, it was actually not like anything like that. And there is no, just in the history of warfare, you don't see this asymmetry at that point. You realize that up to the very last moment, the Crusaders could break the encirclement. So we don't know here how the thing has gone. I mean, that's literally all we get as information is concerned, right? But it's interesting enough to point out that the similarity, for example, that exists with Hattin, with other battles in which the Crusaders were properly even cut out from retreat, or other situations were not easy to cope with. And yet it sounds, at least from this account, these last words, that the fact that the Crusaders could retreat anyway, and that the Turks would abandon their ambushing posts to run after the enemy, that there was at least a way out, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that the Crusaders were here still fully functional. I mean, of course, the Turks now presumed, maybe thanks to their also to their overwhelming numerical superiority, they could simply push on the enemy and melt it in away. But we don't really get any specific ratio strength from this, so it's difficult. Matthew hints, though, at the think that the situation was apparently desperate, so we wouldn't go so... once again, there was probably not this great asymmetry in the condition of both, right? Because for having achieved also the Christian despair, the Turks disband also themselves a lot. We get it also from other battles. There was no other way. So here there is another interesting thing that Baldwin does. Matthew writes, he ordered those in the citadel of Azaz, quote, "When you see that they are pursuing and are close behind us, emit a smoke signal over the fortress." You understand what the point is. So, literally, the Crusaders wanted... so, first of all, they had contact with Azaz, that, as we have seen, had been, partially... here we don't know precisely also what the situation really was, because it's presumable that a part of the Turkish forces was still left at the siege, right? And that those might have been actually the encirclers of the Crusaders. That actually makes sense, because that's also, from the Turkish perspective, like, you're besieging this place, but you're retreating when the enemy approaches. So you leave a block there, but still you lure the largest part of the enemy army from one side. The Crusaders here, however, are in contact with Azaz as well. So the situation is sounds like the Christians kind of either overstretched over these 3 days. They had exposed themselves too much, being worn out. So they decide to show the Turks they're retreating, and signaling to, and asking from the citadel of Azaz to signal them the Turkish move so that at the point they would have been on the pursuit of the Crusaders would have now, as we will see, turned and attacked them face to face. Right, so it was now literally the Christians luring the Turks, and this is very fascinating as well, right? And it's high mastery. Like, if things went like this for real, this is one of the very fascinating proofs of the great Christian flexibility during the Crusade, right? All those prejudices saying, these Turkish forces were always the quickest, the most agile, and so on, and instead the Crusader armies were bulky and heavy. They could do this, right? They could carry out these maneuvers. This is astonishing, as we've seen also many Crusader forces, even around 33% were mounted, so they had also their own flexibility at that point. Then Matthew writes, then the king took all his troops and headed for Al-Atarib. Now, when General Bursuqi learned that the king had fled, he signaled all his troops to unite in pursuit of them, and they went after them like wolves chasing sheep. And so doing, they raised great frightening shouts and went after the troops of the Franks. When the troops of the foreigners had gone 2 miles and reached the troops of the Christians, the smoke signal was issued at Azaz. Seeing it, the king of Jerusalem and all the military commanders cried out to God for aid. Weeping and bitterly lamenting, they hurled heavenward their requests for God's aid, that he deliver aid to his small flock. Then the king commanded that the war trumpet be sounded, and the troops of the Christians unitedly applied themselves to fighting the foreigners. Calling on God for aid, they fought valiantly. The Lord heard their pleas, and they put the Turks to flight with great anger. Then the troops of the Christian faithful put their swords to work and scattered them here and there over the face of the fields. Count Joscelin, in great rage, like a ferocious lion roaring at the oxen it pursued the troops of foreigners, satiating himself with the unbelievers' blood. Similarly, the king and all the troops of Christ pursued the impious ones and unsparingly destroyed them as far as the city of Aleppo. The number of the slain was 7,000. It's very damn high. That's pretty much it. Then he says, okay, this Palazar of the Persian took taken departed full of shame, since 15 emirs had been killed in the fighting. The emir is basically like this is like the baron in this context, at least for Western comparison. The troops of the Christians returned with great joy and with inestimable loot. That was a day of joy for all the believers in Christ. This occurred on the 24th day of the month of Trajan, on a Thursday, a few days. Okay, and here, etc., etc. Goes on. So this is very clear, very interesting at the same time. It's been, you see what's happened. Basically, the Turks have literally followed the Christians while retreating, and they have recompacted all their forces. So that's exactly what actually the Christians were trying to do. That is to say, the Turks were evenly scattered here and there before. Probably, we don't know even about the ground, but possibly at that point, the Christians, even just to pursue the Turks, would have to enter an unfavorable tunnel, probably where the ambuscade was held, and they were aware of it at the same time. And the evident thing is also that the need was to literally concentrate the Turkish mass so that you could charge straight in them. We don't know about the order of this recompacting, right? This is also interesting because we don't know exactly what the internal order of the Turkic army was like at this point. It might have been, I don't know, might have been scarce, we could think. We don't know actually, but this idea of recompaction is implicating in a way also the idea that, especially if the Christians had gotten entangled for such a long time, 3 days with the Turks, and they had been encircled properly by them, it's possible that these Turks just followed basically the Crusaders without kind of redeploying in a way, in an orderly fashion. Given the prearranged maneuver, it's possible that the Christians were also probably already capable of redeploying, had prepared for that, and it was all calculated. So surely this is actually a great result, because it shows the Crusader capability at that point to fake in part, because evidently their weakness, they had evidently gotten weakened, but also the ability to make to start the enemy playing their own game, right? And if this was done, chances are is that also that the Muslims were not just baiting at it for no reason, but that the situation in itself was critical. And I think that Matthew highlights it pretty damn well. He literally talks about the Crusaders crying and praying God with all themselves for helping them, especially when he says when the Turks were following them, that they were inside, had recompacted. So that's not a very comforting sight, eventually. And surely after 3 days of fights, the Crusaders were exhausted. So this was probably a very hotly contested battle, and that's what I was trying to say at the beginning properly. That is, we have just these few accounts of the battle. Here, technically, there are others. I can't tell you even which ones they are. These are, there was William of Tyre for sure, then there is Sigebert of Gembloux, Kemal ad-Din, Bustan, Usama, and then we've read Fulcher of Chartres and Matthew of Edessa, and Michael the Syrian as well. But these are the most informed ones, and the ones on which the battle is fundamentally modeled, historiographically speaking. And the fact that we don't have more information concretely about this is by itself the reason why eventually these battles, who does know the Battle of Azaz? I admit I'd never heard it. Right, I might have even heard it at some point, but I didn't know it before preparing this video. And the point is that this battle might have been actually a pretty good one. Surely it wasn't as big, as important, let's say, as we were comparing it to Hattin before. But it might have been actually a very interesting case of study, and something more devastating than what is usually summarized. Here I read the Jan Heath's 1978 Armies and Enemies of the Crusades description. Relying on their superior numbers, possibly totaling 15,000 horsemen, the Syrians seem to have voluntarily closed for hand-to-hand combat early in the battle. There were 3 days in which, according to Matthew, that is the second most important source, that says that literally the Franks were encircled here. And then it says, but the superiority of the Franks' armor and physique told heavily against them, and after a protracted and bloody melee, so here it's taking it from Fulcher of Chartres, through which he has mostly modeled the thing. The Turks were scattered en route, the Franks collecting an immense amount of booty from the field, so this, which is an information drawn from Matthew of Edessa. So what's the thing? Of course, the author may mean that, probably the day of the battle, so after the 3 days, these guys kind of went to fight against each other in that sense. But it's like this might have happened in ways that we're not completely sure of, right? What is interesting also about the deployment that we read in Fulcher of Chartres is what seems like a pincer movement formation. Why? Because you have the two advanced wings, right, and the bulky center in the rear as a big reserve. So I presume that here the the thing that may have happened is that the Crusaders willingly, but that would be really an amazing thing, and it would be one of really big thing for tactical standards of the time, would have to pass out the annals of military history, but we have no proof of it, unfortunately, to literally try to press the Turks from the rears to concentrate in the center, right? Which would be amazing, because how many Turks were, right? And then now that you have compressed the Turks in between the two wings, you launch this massive charge in the center and you wipe them out, which is apparently what happening here. Naturally, yeah, the losses were very high, like 7,000 for Matteo of Edessa is is a very high number, even for 40,000 men, which were way less. So naturally, we don't have to believe that there were actually 7,000 losses, but 15 emirs, speaks for a bloodbath, right? Because the emir was, after all, the big guy, the local lord, and surely, all their retinues at that point were destroyed, the relative 50 was. So they might have, wouldn't know if they corresponded to the phalanx's leaders, according to Fulcher. So they were at the head of 700 men each, which would make too many troops at that point, even more than 7,000. Or if they were maybe the correspondents of the Christian Kune commanders, which is interesting. It would make good, in fact, 800, more than 800, more actually. 90 per 15 makes, almost 1,000 losses. In fact, 1,000 losses, as we were reading before, is what Ibn al-Athir gives, right? So that may be actually correct. So you see here there are many correspondences. The thing may work as a reconstruction. So we're talking naturally of smaller numbers involved, both in the losses and the even probably in the same engagement, but still the thing does sound correct, and it's very fascinating. I would say, even still thinking about the pincer movement we were saying before, is that the Turks were trying to lure the Christians in an ambush. The Crusaders possibly did the very same thing, right? That thick phalanx, the thick horn that Fulcher of Chartres talks about under the command of Baldwin. There might have been a reserve in the posterior line, right? And that's exactly what we were saying before. So this may be actually a much more interesting battle than the one is simply here summarized by saying, I don't know, and here the author that we're quoting before was saying in the study mostly what Fulcher of Chartres does in a kind of positive way, saying, they simply gave battle, and the Christians went there, they gave battle and won, right? It's not exactly true. Here, there were 3 days in which the situation was alarming, and Matteo of Edessa says, what the hell, these guys were actually struggling, suffering in that encirclement, obviously. So, I think, once again, this is a battle that deserves possibly way more consideration than it has, exactly for tactical reasons. Because it cannot be solved, historically speaking, but it poses some interesting matters that are definitely not to be given for granted from these accounts, and that they may have a logical connection after all. That cannot be proven, unfortunately, but still it is. And this is also for giving an idea of how relying on just one account. By the way, today I did something I usually do not do, but I must say that it's difficult to find sometimes even the simple sources online. I found this too because I already had them, but had there been also just another, now we modeled the video on these two sources, but had there been another source that said something slightly, even just a hint more, that might, we may rework the thing. We may even add more depth to the judgment, to the historical critique, right? And I think it's always, I don't remember what was the other battle that we were. I remember it was the last one we made. If you give me 1 second, I'm searching for it. But just realizing how, if you mostly historiography, at that point I was reading Ibn Runciman, right? The guy that was one of the greatest authorities in the field had basically explained the battle just through one author, and were other 2 or 3 that were definitely worth mentioning, and that presented even in there a much more in-depth picture of the battle compared all together. And this typology of battles is all quite similar. I mean, the thing of the encirclement, of the outstretching, of the thing, it's the Battle of Iran, May the 7th, 1104, right? If you look at that video, we see that Runciman kind of simply skips the sources. And Runciman was one of the pillars of the Crusaders' historiography in the West in the past generation. So the question is, what the hell, right? And this is a bit the same. You read this stuff on Wikipedia or in this other, even Jan Heath was a hell of a medieval warfare historian, right? So naturally he was summing up in that studium. It was a kind of a synthesis, but he needed to be concise, and after all he says the essentials. But the question is that these battles are way more fascinating to study when you actually have this terms of comparison, and these are even easy because this is a 12th century battle. You start studying a 14th century battle, you have 40 sources all together that are also much more detailed and critical and insightful. So that makes you understand how difficult to make history really is, and ultimately also to get to something that is never certain, right? So I make these videos specifically. It happens to me now to have decided to make these this Crusader warfare series, and to discuss every damn single Crusader battle that's ever been fought in these terms. But because I admit, as you know, I'm not specifically can't say I'm not interested, but I never studied thoroughly the Crusader warfare, right? I'm discovering it fundamentally now, and I look at these sources and say, wow, they actually tell a lot, even if 12th century historiography is fairly primitive as we've seen. And where is this attention in the studies, right? Because I personally never read one of all these books I have from mostly, it's disclosing material sometimes, but even on, I searched for this stuff on academia.edu and so on. I have Runciman, I have other, way more updated works by some, what was the expert, I don't remember, this is from the early 2000s. I mean, pretty damn good studies that may not be specifically, military cut oriented, but they should be a bit the base of where studies think from, and what is a bit the sap of historical criticism is pointing out the difficulty of this reconstructions doesn't seem to be much out there. Right? It's mostly about the story. I don't know, having never gotten history specifically in crusading history more than just warfare, and approaching the thing directly from this military point of view now, before everything else, let's say, it's like a shock, because it sounds to me as if maybe we've not been told the history of the Crusades in such useful way. As you know, I have my opinions on the Crusades. I've made lots of videos of it also being criticized at the times, because people look at the Crusades mostly as this clash of cultures reality, but they were something way smoother also in the same political and military affairs compared to all the rest of the world. Of course, we're talking about the 12th century. It's not that these cultures differed dramatically from one another. And I don't know. I think we could make a good use of this information, and that's why I made this video. For the rest, I don't go further because otherwise I start ranting and all this stuff. But it's not cool. But this is the advice. Always be aware of anybody explaining you something in these terms, and even me. Because as we were saying before, I didn't read the other sources, and I doubt that there is much more information, because actually the study that I used there for Fulcher of Chartres actually was philologically minding these other sources. So after all, doesn't sound as if there was excessively much. But had there been just another shade like the ones we have observed today for these two sources, and surely are, well, we would probably get an extra degree of depth and of knowledge about this, right? I also don't know how. Let me search for whether there is a battle of Azaz on YouTube. Battle of Azaz. There is the 1031, which is not this one, and no, nobody has ever done anything about the Battle of Azaz, right? So basically, I'm the first person ever. Why? Right, this is history, right? It's the history of Crusades. It's not a minor, it's a relatively minor engagement, but it's not this great deal. And here also pops out my own Battle of Iran and others, because people just don't talk about this stuff. So I don't really know even who's the audience that watches my Crusader history videos, but let's keep making these, because objectively, as we've seen, they are interesting, and they can help maybe someone just getting the references, or getting an idea broadly meant. Alright, so for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.